Good? And the clicker. Sorry. Why aren't you working? You were working a second ago. All right, I will do this then. I am so pleased to be here to talk about this subject of AI and ethics. So my role at IBM is that I'm IBM Consulting's global lead for Trustworthy AI. There is absolutely nothing easy about curating AI responsibly. In fact, I've taken to illustrating my own comics as my own mechanism for both art therapy, and I hope that it helps me to be a better educator and communicator about this very nuanced and complex space. And the reason why it's so nuanced and complex is because earning trust in AI is not a technical problem. It's not a technical problem with a technical solution. It is a socio-technical problem, which means there's a lot to consider. And indeed, many years ago, when I first got inspired to really focus on this space, there were certainly stories within the news that affected me and impacted me. For example, and again, these are organizations that truly have the very, very best of intentions, because as we know, artificial intelligence is being used in so many powerful ways that make decisions that directly affect our lives. So for example, in the country of Spain, they had procured an AI model to predict the level of recidivism of domestic abusers. And the way that it worked is someone would go into the police, and they would file a complaint with the police about concern of domestic abuse. The police would put in that information into the system, and the system would spit out a score. If the score was high enough, the police would put a protective order in place. If the score was low, they wouldn't do anything. And it was only after 19 women were murdered that they had a conversation and they did an audit of that particular model. In this conversation, of course, included things like, is this really an appropriate use of artificial intelligence? And also, who was in the room when making this determination that this was a good idea? Any victims of domestic abuse? And then, of course, they did find all kinds of bias, including things like, if the complaint came from a wealthier household, they could devalue the risk. Right? Another example of a story is the state of Michigan. They had procured an AI model to predict welfare fraud. It ran for 3 years with an accuracy score of less than 10%. So you had countless families, typically from historically underserved communities, being erroneously fined. And this all came out. ProPublica did a big expose, and they found out that actually there were many different parts of the organization that knew about the accuracy score, and no one was taking accountability, right? Let's see, another example. You've heard most recently this week in the news that President Biden has signed an executive order for AI. He signed another one last February, which you might not know about, mandating that all AI models that are being developed by or used within the US federal government have to be audited for equitable outcomes. And this is because it was found an audit that was done on the IRS that black taxpayers were being audited 3 to 5 times more often than white taxpayers. And it was, again, due to an erroneous algorithm. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I've got a whole book full of these. There are databases full of them as well. Okay, if you see this chart, so the Future of Privacy Forum has done a really phenomenal job categorizing different kinds of both individual as well as societal harm. And you'll see some of the ones that I described: loss of opportunity, economic loss, social detriment, loss of liberty. And it's incredibly important, again, that we approach the challenge of AI in a very considerate fashion. And I'll go into that more in my conversation with you today. But first, I want you to pull out your phones. This is the interactive part of this talk. And I want you to answer this question. Within your organization, which business function or persona is responsible, is accountable for equitable outcomes from AI? You'll see here, I know it might be small print for you, CEO, Chief Privacy Officer, CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, Chief Legal Officer, everyone, no one, other, or the CIO. Who in your organization is accountable? Better? All right. Lots of everyone's. The next one is no one. Some others, some CIO. Well, this is a good mix. I'm going to come back to that in a bit. That's very interesting. When we took the time to ask ourselves this question, what is the relationship that we ultimately want with artificial intelligence, we came up with these 3 principles for trust and transparency. And these 2 seem very, very high level, like they should practically be on a Hallmark card, right? The purpose of AI is to augment human intelligence, meaning it's not meant, the purpose isn't meant to displace human beings. It's not meant to have control over human beings. But then the next step, we as practitioners have to be thinking about how do we measure whether a human being's intelligence has been augmented? What is the experience like of a human when they've been augmented by artificial intelligence? Do they feel empowered, right? The second one is a statement about consent. And the third one talks about transparency and explainability. This is a timeline, and I know this print is also very small, so I'm going to just describe some of the key things on this timeline, which I know have really made a mark on me. So in 2013, we began developing tools to help curators of artificial intelligence develop AI in a more responsible fashion, including tools to do things like mine for bias within data sets. We also, in 2015, we hired our first AI ethics leader, and we began our first data science profession in collaboration with the Open Group. And in 2018, after a very important study came out called Gender Shades, which you may or may not be familiar with, if you're not familiar with Gender Shades, definitely do look up the YouTube video by Joy Bolwamini. It's excellent. We ended up also in that same year pulling out of facial recognition. We published those 3 principles for trust and transparency that I showed you, and we stood up our very first AI ethics board. And I want you to see the kinds of things we've learned we've had to do organizationally after 2018, right? I mentioned making sure that we have people who are trained to be thinking about, is AI empowering, right? What is the experience like of a human being using AI in such a way that it augments their intelligence? We stood up our first AI design guild, right? In order to have practitioners trained to really consider these kinds of questions, trained in things like design. We stood up our first Trustworthy AI Center of Excellence. This is global, diverse, multidisciplinary community of people who deeply care about the subject of AI ethics so that they can get applied learning within this space. We published Everyday Ethics. We published our Scaled Data Science Method. Again, really big focus on continuous training, in particular applied training throughout the entire organization. We found typically about 80% of investments, typically, and this was before generative AI, they would get stalled in proof of concept. Oftentimes, either A, because the investments being made in AI were never directly tied to business strategy to begin with, or B, people just weren't trusting the results of the model. So we spent a lot of effort thinking about what does it take to earn someone's trust? What are the human-centric questions that have to be considered, right? First one is fairness. Of course, AI models should be fair, you might think. But again, there's a lot of complexity just thinking about what fairness means, because what I think is fair might not be what Chris thinks is fair, or what you think is fair, because there's actually many different worldviews on the subject of fairness, right? The second one, explainability. Right? As you have an AI model that's making a particular determination or an output, you should be able to know what data was used to make this particular determination. What was the most important methodology used behind this particular approach? Again, so I can know whether it's trustworthy. The third, adversarial robustness, right? Making sure it's tamper-proof. Transparency. Am I even being told that an AI model is being used? Right? Who's accountable for this model? Has this been audited? When was it last audited? What was it audited for? How much better does this model perform compared to a human being? Aren't these all things that we should know to ask? Aren't these all things that we should be training our people to ask, or at the very least our next generation to ask, right? And then, of course, lastly, data privacy. Our systems of inequity do perpetrate into our technologies. It's why we're saying this is a socio-technical challenge. And whenever you have a socio-technical challenge, you have to approach it holistically, meaning people, process, tools. People meaning what is the right organizational culture required to curate AI responsibly? What are the right AI governance processes and the right tools and AI engineering frameworks? Can you guess of these three, which is the toughest? Guess. People. It's always the toughest. It's always the toughest. And the reason why it's so hard is because of the nature of data itself. Data is an artifact of the human experience. Right? We humans, we make them a data, or the machines that make the data, and we have over 188 biases and counting. Many of these biases, and these are for very good reasons that we have them. We human beings have cultivated these biases over time. Our data is biased. So the key is AI is an incredible mirror that reflects our biases back to us. And we have to be brave enough and introspective enough to look in this mirror and say, are the biases that are being reflected back, do they align with my organization's values? If they do, be transparent about it. Here's why we picked this data. Here's why we picked this approach. If it doesn't align, that's when you know you have to change. But it does take bravery. Most people think that 100% of the effort to develop AI is coding. It's not true. Well over 70% of the effort is making sure you're just picking the right data for the problem. Right? So you have to have people, again, trained to ask hard questions about data, like, was this gathered with consent? Is this representative of all the communities that I'm trying to serve? More often than not, when data scientists take the time to ask a domain expert, is this the right data to use to solve this problem? The answer is no. So you have to have domain expertise as well. That's, again, helping to influence the approach of how these models are built. This is an example of a design thinking framework that came out of our AI Design Guild that I was just describing to you. And this is really cool because it's an exercise that is done in a group, but not just any group. When we do these kinds of exercises with people, we say, bring the most diverse group of people you can possibly get your hands on. And I'm not just talking about diversity in terms of gender or race, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, but indeed different lived world experiences. Right? Because the exercises that we do here require people who have varying lived world experiences to be thinking about what does potential harm look like, right? And so this one that you see on the left, called layers of effect, you start off with what is the primary intent for this particular model. And it's not until you get to the tertiary part where you start to get to unintended effects. What could unintended effects possibly look like? Because again, these are organizations that have really the best of intentions. And then the second aspect, the second part called ethical hacking, you take a potential harm and you start thinking through what are the principles for trust and transparency for that particular organization. Then what are the concrete rights of end users? What are their rights as a human being? And then given those rights, how would you design in order to protect them, in order to prevent or mitigate harm? And I've done this with high school kids. I've done this with middle school kids. This isn't a technical challenge, right? I want you to think about, in the rest of this presentation, how can artificial intelligence better reflect the variety of communities that it serves? And in this same question, I'd have you consider what is the right organizational culture that is required to curate AI responsibly? There are three major factors. The first one is that you have to approach the space with humility. You have to have an open growth mindset. If you're focused on artificial intelligence and thinking about how can we have AI better reflect the communities that it serves, you have to have an open growth mindset, approach it with humility, because as much as there is to learn, there's also a lot that has to be unlearned. The second is, again, you've got to be thinking about the level of diversity and inclusivity of your teams. And then the third, and then to highlight what I'm saying with respect to diversity and inclusivity, today there's this teeny tiny homogeneous group of people developing AI. Teeny tiny. And in order to have AI better reflect all the varying communities that we must serve, we've got to have far more different kinds of human beings developing AI with us. And you'll see, these numbers. Right? Who's working in tech today versus who's working in AI? 33% women in tech, only 6% working in AI. 10% Black, Indigenous people of color, only 6% AI. LGBTQ+, 4% tech, 1% AI. And then the third aspect is that the teams developing AI, working on AI, and I would say even working in AI governance, have to be multidisciplinary. They have to be multidisciplinary. And I did this comic because I was so frustrated when I would go to AI summits, when I would go and open up most white papers on the subject of artificial intelligence. They were only communicating to certain kinds of people, right? Not sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, behavioral scientists, legal experts, all of these other types of people with skills and competencies that are very different, right? We weren't being inclusive of them, and that has to change. And I'll explain to you why. When organizations develop a lot of models and are capturing the inventory, really important information about the models that they're putting out into the world, they commonly use these things called risk assessment forms, right? Algorithmic impact assessment forms, where basically it's a survey and they're asking AI model owners really important questions about their models, like what's the purpose of this, right? How are you approaching fairness? What's the potential for harm? What does disparate impact look like? How are you going to make your model explainable? I commonly see 4 patterns of concern, right? Whenever, and these patterns of concern go across geography, across role, go across education level. Fundamentally, people do not understand disparate impact. Individuals who are developing AI models do not understand disparate impact. They do not understand it. Why? I think it's because they weren't taught in schools. They weren't taught in schools. I've come across people developing AI models to determine what percentage interest rates people get on home loans who don't know the history of redlining. They've never heard of it before. So it's incredibly important, again, as we approach this with humility, that we focus on this multidisciplinary education. And what you're seeing here, this is a snapshot of all the different investments, again, we've had to make across all these business functions at IBM. And I'm not saying these are just like, synchronous training where you're sitting in a class and it's like October is AI Ethics Month. No. I'm also not saying it's asynchronous training, like go read this playbook or watch this video and consider yourself certified. No. We do those, we do synchronous and asynchronous training, but we also do applied training, which is so incredibly important. And the way that we roll out applied training is through our Center of Excellence. And the way that this works is we say, when we first stood up our Center of Excellence years ago, we said, we don't care what your background is. We don't care that you're a psychologist, an anthropologist, sociologist. You're interested in the subject of AI and AI ethics. You are welcome here. We want you. We need you. We need your brains, right? You have a seat at this table. And then we work on global, diverse, multidisciplinary teams on real projects. Again, to give people this experience around what does it take to develop AI in a responsible way. So one example, what does the Titanic teach us about explainable AI? Right? That's an example that actually Brown University recently picked up. We split up into 2 work streams. We took a semi-fictitious data set off of Kaggle, and we thought through, like, what if there was an AI model that was giving predictions to Titanic passengers about the likelihood of them getting a life raft, right? What does that look like? Again, given the bias of the day, and of course it's a biased data set, of course. How do we empower passengers on the Titanic? What does that look like, right? What is the experience? What are the things that have to be considered? More recently, we did a project with the United States Chamber of Commerce that finished up about a month or 2 ago. They wanted to use an AI agent to have conversations with individuals from under-credentialed communities about their skills and competencies. And they wanted our help to assess risk, right? So for example, let's see, under-credentialed communities includes incarcerated people, includes caregivers, includes gig workers or soldiers. And they're thinking an AI agent will have conversations with a mother of 4 to have a conversation with her about what her skills and competencies are with respect to being a project manager or a logistician or a nutritionist or an event planner, right? And again, these aren't technical problems strictly, but indeed socio-technical. Because again, these were wonderful, wonderful opportunities for, again, these global, diverse, multidisciplinary teams to work together on these challenges. And we've publicly published these reports if you're curious about them. When you hear the words AI governance, think of it as 2 sides of a coin. There's organizational AI governance, right, which is, what are your principles? What are your pillars? What are you communicating? How are you training people? What are your communities of practice? How are you incentivizing the behaviors of your practitioners? Do you have an AI ethics board? Does it have enough teeth to take down projects? Is there a rotating leadership model? How do you do risk assessments? Right? How are you gathering your inventory? Do you mandate keeping fact sheets? Are those interpretable? Like, that's all organizational AI governance. And then there's automated AI model governance, which is in the blue. This is when, of course, you're using tools and other AI engineering methods, again, to audit your models, to look for specific patterns. Both of these are really key, and we need to do both. We do both in order to do AI governance. So all the things that I've described to you, again, that we've learned we had to do, from standing up an ethics board, establishing the principles, doing the kinds of education we've learned we've had to do, the assessments, the audits, these are all the things that we also help our clients with. When it comes to generative AI, what we're finding is this question of trust is evolving from, do I trust this AI model, to does the worldview being represented in AI match my own? I was recently invited by the government of the United Arab Emirates to fly out for an AI summit. And the whole subject of the conference was on how can we have AI better reflect our community. And their question was, whose ethics? Your ethics? Western ethics? Whose ethics? Right? Whose worldview? Whose worldview is being represented in AI? So I'll ask you guys this question. Do you happen to know within the first 60 days, how quickly did ChatGPT's user base grow? Very good. Well, the answer is 9,000. Actually, over 9,000. 9,900% within the first 60 days. And here too, we see major causes of concern, right? 80% have listed ethics, explainability, bias, trust as being major causes of concern with respect to adoption. And many of the risks that are now being introduced with generative AI are quite new in comparison to more traditional predictive forms of artificial intelligence. And I'll go into that in a bit, including cybersecurity concerns. This is just a subset, a list of subset of cybersecurity concerns from generative AI. I've been working with a lot of CISOs lately. And in fact, there's this group called Team 8. They're an advisory council that makes up a number of global CISOs around the world to, again, ask them what they feel their responsibilities are with respect to generative AI. And you'll see some of the things listed here. And I want you to notice the line item for bias and discrimination. Under bias and discrimination, they say currently out of scope for security as it is a more generic AI/ML issue. And so many of these CISOs are pointing up to the top saying that is the role of the CEO. The CEO sets the stage with respect to the stance, the corporation stance on bias and discrimination. But at least within IBM, it is the responsibility of each and every business unit to tackle all of these things. Like, yes, the CEO needs to set the stage and the culture and the tone, but at the accountability level, it's at each business unit. When it comes to large language models in particular, large language models are excellent at predicting the next syntactically correct word in a sentence. That's what they're good at. But they don't, by their nature, understand the meaning of words. So they come with a package of different kinds of considerations, limitations. You might have heard the word hallucination. In essence, this is when you'll have an output that is totally erroneous, totally bogus. You might have training data that's squeaky clean, but the output might be completely biased. There might be concerns about where the training data came from. Was it gathered with consent? I mentioned the cybersecurity concerns. I mentioned environmental costs. Have you experienced a hallucination from a large language model before? Let me move the little cursor. These are fun. That's interesting. Huh. If I have time, I'll tell you about the Girl Scouts. If I don't have time to tell you about the Girl Scouts, pull me aside afterwards because I did this session with them and it was awesome. All right. So most of you, yes, a lot of you know. So I'm going to show you one of my favorite hallucinations. So my sister, she's a VR game engineer out in Vancouver, and her studio specializes in horror games. And lucky me, I get to play test them, right? So here she is having a conversation with the large language model, asking it the simple question, who is Ismini Roby? That's her name, right? So she's asking it for a bio. And you'll see this output saying, oh, she works for this game company and she's published all these games and she wrote this book. Nothing in here is true except that she's a gameplay engineer. And the reason why this is so dangerous is because you see the little numbers, you see those little annotations? It expresses this with such confidence, like it has authoritative proof, evidence. And that's what's dangerous. And when she was telling my mother and I this story and showing us this, my mother says, well, isn't there some form you can fill out or someone you can call? It's like, there's no one to call. Who are you going to call, right? Have you ever experienced biased output from an AI-powered image generator before? Have you guys played around with an image generator before? These are fun. These are so fun. Ooh, lots of yeses for this one. Great. All right, so this is these are images from a fantastic video that came out not too long ago from the London Interdisciplinary School. They were showing these wonderful statistics. First of all, they did a number of different studies asking an image generator to show it images of like, show me what a typical prisoner looks like. Show me what a CEO looks like. Show me what a terrorist looks like. Show me what a doctor looks like. And then seeing, like, for example, with doctor, right, how often when they prompted the image generator to show an image of a doctor, did it show a female doctor? Here in the United States, about 39% of doctors are women, whereas the image generator only showed a woman 7% of the time. So this is an example of what representational harm is. The study went even further to ask it to generate a Barbie doll to represent each country around the world, right? So, for example, it showed all the Barbies from all the South American countries had blonde hair and light skin. The one from South Sudan, you can see here, is holding a machine gun. Do you see it? Right? So again, just an excellent example of representational harm. This one recently came out. This was being showcased on NPR. The prompt was, show me a black doctor treating white children as patients. And it could not do it. It could not do it. They kept prompting again and again, show me a black doctor treating white children as patients. It could not do it. Right? And again, this was all showcased on National Public Radio. So fascinating, again, to see. We recently came out with another Institute for Business Value study talking about the return on investment for AI ethics, and we found that only 25% of executives have been able to operationalize common principles of AI ethics. So when it comes to generative AI, I want to talk about what does it actually take in order to operationalize something like explainability. Like, let's say, absolutely, explainability is critically important for us to be able to trust these models. What, in essence, it means is you have to show your work. You've got to be able to demonstrate data, lineage, and provenance, right? The data, lineage, and provenance behind what is being used to make the decision by that particular AI model. For example, like, let's say you're a nurse in training, and you are using a generative transformer to train with. So you ask this large language model the following question. I'm going to place a 24-gauge IV into an adult. What is my next step? If you place a 24-gauge IV into an adult, you are going to harm the adult because it is meant for infants, right? So if your AI doesn't understand the context or the meaning of those words in its sequence, right, then you're going to cause harm. So it's incredibly important, again, that you are not, in these kinds of situations where you have to show or demonstrate data lineage and provenance, you're not using a generative transformer in isolation. You're pairing it with something that has that kind of content grounding. And that can be in the form of a semantic search or an ontology. But again, with every output saying, here's how I know what I know. Here's the verifiable, trusted sources of data where I am pulling this information. And ultimately, what you're using the generative transformer for is coming up with all the variations of language, but that's not where you're getting the actual answer from. And again, it's incredibly important that we double down our investments in AI ethics, again, so that we can trust our models. And you can see here, 69% of employees say they would be more willing to accept a job offer from organizations that are socially responsible. People care. People want to work for socially responsible companies. I frequently get asked, what can I do? I don't feel like I'm in a particular position of power where I'm working, but I deeply care about this subject. What can I do? Help us advocate for a more accessible and inclusive education on the subject of data and AI ethics. Right? If you're lucky enough today to take a class in data and AI ethics at a higher ed institution, typically you've self-categorized as a data scientist or machine learning scientist or computer scientist. If you're lucky, you'll get such a class, but not everybody else. Certainly not our next generation of legislators. And as we're using AI in every aspect of industry, as we're using AI as end users, again, shouldn't we be better informed? And by the way, shouldn't we be introducing this subject in civics class in high school, even not middle school? Civics class. Isn't that where artificial intelligence belongs? So, I'm on the advisory board for a number of different schools, and I'm on the advisory board of a museum, a children's museum near me called Marbles. And I was asked to participate in a kids' code event where I could present on anything that I wanted to present on. So I wanted to think and use play, because my background is actually from video games. I wanted to use play as a mechanism to see if I could introduce the subject to young kids. And I was thinking, like, how young can I go, right? So with a local high school, Raleigh Charter High School, we co-created an AI-powered Harry Potter sorting hat. Do you guys remember the sorting hat in the book, right? You put the hat on your head and it uses magic to sort of mine your brain, determine which Hogwarts house you're going to go into. So the hat worked similarly, right? There's a hidden microphone in the hat, and as a child says something about themselves, it is connected to a laptop running a simple natural language processor that would put them into a Hogwarts house. And then the kids we were working with were brilliant, right? They had these Lego Mindstorms. They had the lips on the hat move, and it would say, Hufflepuff, right? So what I didn't tell anybody is I rigged the hat. I rigged it so that if any of my 4 children were to put the hat on their head up on stage and say something I totally guessed they would say, it would put them into Slytherin, which I knew they would hate. Not that there's anything wrong with Slytherin, mind you. I have to couch that at the beginning. So it works like a charm, right? So the kids are up on stage, the hat's putting them into all these great houses, Gryffindor and Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw, and they're all happy. And then my daughter, she was 13 at the time, she gets up on stage. She puts the hat on her head, she says something I totally guessed she would say, and the hat says, Slytherin. And she crosses her arms and she glares at me, and she says, Mom, you rigged the hat. And I said, let this be a lesson to you. Never trust an AI that's not fully transparent and explainable. You should be able to ask the hat, what data did you use about me to put me in a Slytherin? Which actually inspired this comic, right? Here she is saying, wait, why was I put in a Slytherin? And you'll see all this gobbledygook. I call it math-splaining, and this is actually extrapolated from a real fact sheet. Again, to remind our practitioners developing metadata about their models to please make it interpretable to people so that, again, they can feel empowered. So in closing, I'll have you consider, as you come across job roles for artificial intelligence within your organizations, notice what kinds of skills and competencies they're asking for. Notice it. Right? Remember what I told you about disparate impact? How people don't understand? They don't understand. They may say things like, why should I worry about my model possibly being unfair if I'm not gathering personal information? This is a major, major problem. Major problem. We have to have a much more interdisciplinary approach towards how we both teach our practitioners and what kinds of expectations on their skills and competencies we're looking for as we bring them into our organizations. Yeah? Thank you so much for your time today. I did write a book. It's called AI for the Rest of Us. These comics and more and lots of stories are in there, and please do not hesitate to reach out to me if I can help you in any way. And thank you so much for your time today. You've been a great audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phaedra. That was absolutely wonderful. Just fascinating to hear how AI models are so driven by the data that we feed into them, and how responsible all of us are to make sure that they're as inclusive and as diverse as possible.